So welcome everybody to joining. I'm sure there are people on their way, folks going to join very soon. Let me welcome you. My name is Lau. I'm the president for the Association of Change Management Professional in Hong Kong, short for ACMP. So we are professional bodies who look into change management, transformations, and innovation, a number of great topics. So great to welcome you tonight. Richard, my colleague, Vernon, we work together in many projects, and perhaps he can introduce him in a bit. So what we're going to do to talk about is we're going to pick up what we left off last time. You might have joined us, that we talked about remote working in a kind of COVID and post-COVID world. But we want to switch attention now to talk about persuasion. Persuasion, it's something core that we do as professionals. But the interesting thing is then what actually changed from a face-to-face situation to a more online situation. So we're going to talk about that tonight. So maybe Richard, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name's Richard Vernon. I'm a director here at ACMP Hong Kong. I've been in Hong Kong for nearly 10 years now, working on various programs in a project manager, program manager, change and business analysis capacity. And persuasion is one of my favorite things, for reasons we'll get into a little bit later. So I think that's it for the introduction. I will just say that how it's going to go is we're going to talk about the bits of persuasion that have changed, and we're going to look at 3 elements of persuasion in online circumstances, which are the preparation work, how you structure your argument, and how you deliver it. And then quite simple practical advice on good things to do and bad things to do. So we do want to talk for a bit about why we're interested in persuasion in remote work. So most of us have spent our whole lives innately having an understanding of what persuades and what doesn't. And it's something which few of us have been taught. I mean, you might have been taught it in certain situations, such as sales and things. Most people haven't been taught it. Most people have just got a gut feel for what works for them, and they tend to have a certain way of persuading. So moving online changes many of the things that you do. It stops a lot of them working, to put it simply. Many of the methods we use to persuade face-to-face, they don't translate well online. So we want to talk about which ones work, which ones don't work, and what you should do about it. So this is also because we think the switch is permanent in online work. There will hopefully be a strong recovery in face-to-face work as well, but everyone has learned how to do this, and there's no way this isn't going to become a major part of our lives ongoingly. And so we think it's appropriate that if it's going to be something we do a lot of, we should be doing it as well as we can reasonably do it. And we think it's worth putting that bit of effort in to get these results. So I'll talk about my experience of persuasion, and then Leon can talk about his. So before my 10 years in Hong Kong, I used to be an opera singer in Europe. And when you're a singer and a musician, you're given other people's words, and you've got to take those words and persuade the audience. And I found this is very interesting in learning the methodology of persuading, because they have to find you compelling. And you can't do it through your argument, because it's not your argument. You have to do it through all the other methods at your disposal. And especially in concert singing, where you're standing still and you're singing to a microphone and you're not really acting. So you haven't really got much you can do physically. You've just got your voice. And for me, this is really a natural transition into these video meetings where I could do everything I like with my hands, but you're not going to see them, they're off screen, and you're not going to find them compelling. And in a meeting face-to-face, maybe you'd believe me a bit more, but in this meeting, they don't do anything. So it has to be in the voice, which is what really interests me. So Leon, perhaps you'd like to talk about why this is a subject that you're into as well.
Yeah, I'll try to be precise, because that could go on for a bit. So I'll try
Always.
to. So the interesting thing is, I obviously come from Oriental culture. I was educated in Hong Kong, and then went to boarding school in the UK. And then that's interesting, the kind of collision of cultures, and the use of language, and the way that how people argue and then put their case gradually become dawned on me that actually there's interesting way, the alternative way to put forward your argument apart from just banging on the table. And then I was doing a lot of work in the last 20 odd years to become professional consultants. So I persuaded my clients, I do sales, I work with my colleagues, and I win in roles that I actually don't have authority. So persuasion is the only way that I can do that. And I started in the last few years, start training both clients and also my own consultants in persuasion skills. And it's actually a lot of fun. Now, are we going to come on and talk about what do we mean by persuasion here? This is largely a very old subject, and it's about the use of language. And it's actually very direct, and there's actually nothing covert about this. It's actually putting a case forward. So it's actually not about manipulation. So I guess that one of my qualifications is I actually analyze films, and I love films and all that. So actually, the learning how to look at language and the use of language is actually a lot of fun. And Richard is being an opera singer, and he persuades his audience. And my one really important qualification is I have a husky, and I've learned how to persuade my husky to behave. And you think if that is easy, then you can try. So, and that's really interesting because, by the way, one of the really interesting books on persuasion is How to Argue with Your Cat, and it's a real book. So sometime I'm going to write something on how to persuade my husky.
Okay, thanks, Leon. So let's just quickly recap on what our focus is going to be. So Leon just called some of this out. Let's just go over it. Persuasion is changing a person or group's behavior or attitudes. In the way we're going to look at it, we're talking about the direct, visible, and obvious attempt to change behavior. Excuse me. Influence, on the other hand, would be the slower, less direct, less visible, less obvious attempt to change behavior. And both are critical to achieving lasting change. Influence takes much more time. Leon and I, working in consultancy for so many years, you live or die by your ability to influence and also by your ability to persuade. That's just the way we're framing this.
Yeah.
So
Richard, let's just want to talk a little bit more about the way that we take the subject. So we are not covering some of the stuff that you might find in books and articles that really talk about persuasion in marketing. So there's a whole ballgame in its own self. That's kind of under the surface. You don't really see it. So there are a whole body of work around persuasion. Our core, I mean, as Richard is showing this slide, the core and how it fits in is actually a very, very ancient subject. It's actually something called rhetoric. Now, perhaps a little bit of theory, if I may. Perhaps in less than 100, 200 years ago, rhetoric, logic, and arithmetic is probably the only three subjects, core subjects of any children in Europe. So actually it's a core been taught, and it's been tested and tried for a very, very long time. And it's really about language base. So I'm going to come on to talk a little bit more about what the elements are. We're going to be covering the bits that I think will be highly relevant to a remote working situation, and we can come on to that a bit more. So let me talk the core principle. Is that the one thing that you can take it away from this is the first point, right? It's from our famous sage Aristotle. He said that the fool tells me his reason, the wise man persuades me with my own. You have to read it again and just to clear. We tend to persuade people using our own reason. And the more that you're professional, the more that you are specialized, you tend to take on and use your own reasons. I guess many of us who are actually on the call, on the webinar today, are professionals. And we tend to do that using our own reasons. But the really important change is you persuade people with their reasons. And that's the core principle. What do they care about? Not what you care about. That's really the core of persuasion. Now, to do that, Aristotle and the guys, all the philosophers after him, really look at three components or elements. And these are Latin Greek words: ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos or ethos really mean the credibility and authority in a particular persuasion. Now, you can see it everywhere. You got people who acting as spokesmen for certain products, and you talk about your credential And these are really the ethos. And pathos is actually looking at how do you engage and empathize the emotions and provoke the emotions of your audience. And you use happy, sad, afraid, angry, all those kind of emotion and metaphors to engage your audience. And then the last but not least is logic. Now, this is very interesting. Aristotle say it's not true logic that matters, it's the appearance of logic. Now, you have to think about that one a bit more. So they appear to be logical. So these are things that have been used, and I think if you were familiar with that, you can see it's been used everywhere, and you use different mix of that. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how these are actually used in real life and how you actually then use it in online. Now, just another point about different dimensions. There are people who have done work and try to relate ethos, pathos, and logos to neuroscience, but that's another interesting topic another time. I think just to add more credibility to the three elements, but most speakers understand those are the three elements that you can mix and match and really create that really important persuasive speech. So we're talking about very much verbal here, because we're in online, we're talking about, I think in written situation, there's also similar rhetoric principles, but we're really talking about ethos, pathos, and logos in a verbal communication in the online situation. Richard, do you want to add something to that?
Yep, okay, and so thank you, Leon. So we're taking those and then we're then at the same time balancing them against the things that you do in an online meeting, which is you do something to prepare for it, you do something in structuring and writing what you're going to say, or if you're not written it down, you're thinking about what you're going to say, and then you do something in how you deliver it, how you choose to deliver it. So we're looking at the intersection of those two things, the pillars of how it works, plus the realities of how this happens and how it plays out in a remote meeting. And we're looking at the things that are broken down by moving to remote meetings and the problems that causes, and then what you can do about it, or what are the things you should focus on. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk through the preparation work for remote meetings. We're going to talk through structuring, and we're going to talk through delivering. We're going to focus a little more on structuring and delivering, because that is where the persuasive art happens. Preparation is very important, because if you don't do it right, it kills your ability to persuade. So preparation is one of those things that it's ticking boxes, but these boxes, if not ticked, can ruin your other work. So it will get a couple of slides, but we'll move through those slides a little bit more quickly and then really land on the juicier sections in how you put together your package, how you put together your deck, how you put together your argument, and how you deliver it. So with that said, I think we'll move on to the first slide. So preparation and professionalism for remote work. So the image there at the top, it's 4 people representing the same company. The one on the left has got a nice background and their clothes. Doesn't really have some sense of coherence with the others. The second one is sitting way back from the camera and you can't quite hear them. The third one is doing a good job, sitting nice forward and they're very loud. And the fourth one has missed the meeting invite. It's a bit of a joke, but these things matter in an environment where you want to be cohesive. Now, Leon and I aren't making an effort to be cohesive here. We are cohesive in terms of our argument and what we believe, but we're not dressing the same way. We've not got the same background. We've not got a logo on the front. But if we were going along and there were 4 of us presenting to an important meeting representing a company, those elements would need to be consistent. So what you're looking for is your credibility, and your credibility is derived from you look like you know what you're talking about. Have you got these things worked out? It's about nothing getting in the way of you delivering your arguments in this case. So remote meetings have more dependencies and more moving parts than face-to-face meetings. And there's more things to control. There's really menial things like your video software being updated correctly, your microphone, your speakers, your headset, camera, internet, connection quality, the room lighting. Room lighting is a funny one. You can have a window over there and you start your meeting at 4 p.m. everything's fine, and suddenly you've been on a 2-hour meeting and it gets dark and you haven't thought about what's going to happen when it gets dark. It's little things like that. And when you're trying to persuade, anything that draws the audience out of your words gets in the way. So try and control it. Background noise, things like that. I mean, I had drilling underneath my apartment in the last 2 or 3 days, so background noise is one of those variables that you can't always think about, but when you can do. So there's also the human organizational element, which is just be very clear about timings, be very clear about instructions, make decisions about the variables, make decisions. Is everyone going to have their video on, their video off? Is everyone going to be muted by default, not muted? Are we having a window for questions at the end, which we are, or are we not? Are we going to take them in the middle of the meeting? It's just having a little bit of organization. And again, the idea is if you don't do it, it can get in the way. These elements will hit you and they ruin your momentum. So I've talked already about it's difficult to show corporate or brand consistency between multiple presenters online. It takes quite a bit of effort just to align that. And usually that's not important, but when it is important, you have to do something about it. And you need to have coordination and test sessions for all of this stuff. You just need to. You can't really afford to hope that the situation is just going to be fine. And you need, if it's a really important meeting, you need your backups. So we'll just go straight into the do and don't for this, because this isn't really persuasion. This is about things that block persuasion if you don't do them. So the do's: make sure your setup works and is tested. Do, if you have more than one presenter, check on the consistency. Do trial sessions, know how the software works, who is doing what. This one is important because you get things like document sharing in the middle of a meeting, and people realize that they've never tried to share documents in Teams before because they're used to using Zoom, and suddenly they don't know how to do it. They're opening up the wrong screen, and you just lose it. If you're trying to be, if you're trying to have an argument or an ongoing energy and enthusiasm to what you're saying, it's gone at that point. So have all your documents, your materials open, ready, close everything else, close your email pop-ups. Wonderful experience sitting in the room presenting to a steering committee with government directors in Hong Kong, and my colleague's resignation acceptance email popped up on our projector because he had his email client open and it said, "Thank you, we accept your resignation." It was brilliant. It was just exactly what you don't need in the middle of a meeting when everyone sees it. Have backups ready if you're doing a really important meeting. Don't assume an untested setup works. Don't turn up at the hotel with your laptop and your Wi-Fi and jump straight into the big meeting without checking that actually it's fit for purpose. Test it if you can. Don't forget how you look to other viewers. It makes a big difference. Anything inconsistent with your messaging, if you're, my messaging here is I'm just talking to you guys, but if my messaging was trying to sell a product, it would probably be much slicker. I'd be dressed differently. Don't rely on the natural light. I've already talked about that. If you need to, get some light so that they keep you, lit. It's a really silly little thing, and it matters in video meetings in a way that it never matters in real life. And don't use stuff you haven't tested. So Leon, before we jump into the more interesting stuff from this point onwards, have you got anything else to add on preparation? I'm sure you do.
So I think these are things that some of the attendees here would have picked up bits and pieces. So how does that work in a online world when we're trying to persuade? So just think about it, right? If you're doing face-to-face, the first thing the speaker will need to do is to really understand what he or she trying to do. It might seem so obvious, but I've been to many presentation or online sessions, and you were to ask a question, what are you trying to achieve? The answer is always the agenda, but it's not the agenda. It's what is the outcome? What is it that you want people to walk away? What is it that you try to impact? What is the call to action? If you can't articulate the call to action, then your presentation will really fail, and you will be probably very difficult to make a persuasion. Because I don't think there's anything, if you were to do an online presentation or communication session with no call to action, then why? So therefore you're not persuading. So therefore it's thinking about the outcome, and then work through, and then we're going to talk a bit about structuring. How are you going to persuade your people, the people there, from where they are to where they need to be? That could be half an hour, or it might be a first step towards something, but you need to work out that strategy. And that is not the same as your content material. Right. So I think you have to work out that. We're going to come on, I'm going to touch on this point, and just as a question in your mind. On an online session, how do you demonstrate that you're trustworthy? This is the ethos. Because you don't have body language, I can't show open posturing, so I can't use body language. How am I going to do that in an online setting? I think it's actually a particular handicap if you're trying to persuade when you're online situation. Hold that thought. I'll come back to that.
Okay, thanks, Leon. So let's jump into the structuring. So to start with, first of all, if you're presenting on PowerPoint, people's eyes immediately are drawn to the pictures, so you should explain your pictures if they're not self-explanatory. So one of the main decisions in structuring is whether or not you go with a story-based structure or whether you go with the sort of make it obvious-based structure. So we're going to talk through the merits of both of those. Normally in meetings, stories are a very effective way of bringing someone around to your point of view, but they do rely on the audience hearing the story. And in circumstances where you're doing an online presentation, an online webinar, you're not always sure that your audience is following the story. So if your story requires them to understand all of the component parts before the conclusion makes sense, it becomes a little bit more risky. And equally, people naturally view webinars a little bit more like watching TV channels, and they kind of quite quickly make a decision on whether or not they're going to stick with it or whether they're going to just sort of browse another stuff in a different window. And a story-based model, you might lose them early on because you're not hitting them with the exciting stuff. You're trying to build up to it. It's not the same as being in a room with people where they're having to listen to you. Now, maybe they are listening to every word you say, but there's a good chance they're not. So the alternate is Minto's pyramid, big idea type structure, which is where you go straight in with your executive summary or the main point you're going to make, and you make the immediate conclusion. And then you follow that up with the argument, how we got to that conclusion, and following the argument, you present the data. Now, in online meetings, if you're not sure who your audience is, there's a strong argument that says, go for the second, go for the making it obvious, because it's one of those things where you're at least getting the best chance of delivering the value and persuading because you're being very upfront. If you're telling the story structure, you might really, really compellingly persuade 2 or 3 people, and the others might have just tuned out. So remote meetings actually make storytelling structure less effective. And some of us have been using storytelling for years. I mean, it's one of my favorite techniques. I mean, I love it. It doesn't mean you can't do it. You can have a story within a slide or a story within a section. It just means you should be a little bit careful about creating a structure that relies on A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F, all of them to be understood before you get the conclusion. Yeah, so the larger and less engaged in your presentation the audience is likely to be, the stronger the recommendation to avoid storytelling for your central argument, which is very difficult because you've got to appreciate this is quite counter to a lot of the way that our thinking about people has been developing over the past 10 years or so. And a lot of our work is much more user focused, much more customer focused, and we're looking at customer journeys. We're thinking more about people. And when you think more about people, you think more about the story they're going through, and it's become a naturally, there's been a natural great focus on this. And actually it's something that, yeah, you might have that focus, but you might need to go into that focus through the structure of big idea, arguments, evidence. So then the other thing would be that you want to plan your presentation to start strongly and develop this rapport. I mean, Leon touched on how do you develop your rapport with your audience. So you can tell them who you are, and you can have demonstrated who you are with your, your credibility. I've done this, I've done that. Or you can talk to something that you think they're going to be into that says, oh, I empathize with this person. But you probably need a plan for it. because it's not as easy. In a meeting in real life, you might have met the other people outside the room beforehand, shaken a few hands, had a bit of a chat, had a bit of a joke, and then the meeting kicks off, and then you're into meeting mode. But you don't get that here. So you don't get that ability to be human. So I think you've got to be quite deliberate about what you choose to say and what you don't choose to say. So start strongly and end strongly. As Leon said, the call to action, you've got to have something. So then the other thing would be that there's a natural element of energy. So I think a good way to think of a good video session is like a good radio show where you have a couple of presenters or one person and they keep it going, and you keep listening and you keep tuned in. And radio shows are about keeping a certain level of energy going. If there's a pause, something jumps in very quickly to keep the momentum. And a lot of these meetings, it's the same type of thing. So if you're going to have breaks, questions, you want to make sure they're balanced against you keeping the momentum of your argument, the momentum of your story, and the engagement going. And even engagement in its own right is a completely different story in an online meeting, because people are more reticent to put their hand up and say, hey, I've got a question, and interrupt you. So quite often, it feels as if you're talking to a computer and you're getting nothing back. And many people, especially people who really are into other people's and emotive people, they rely on the energy they get back from other people, and you don't get the energy because the face on the screen is your own face, as you're the speaker, and you're talking to thin air as far as that energy is concerned. So you have to keep it going yourself. And therefore, it helps to be deliberate in your planning for anything that interrupts energy. If it's a long meeting, you're going to take a break. Take it deliberately, put it in the agenda. We're going to take a break at this time for 5 minutes, and then get back into it and come back in with the same level of energy. And so one more thing on structuring before Leon jumps into this, which he'll be absolutely chomping at the bit to go at this. Images and pictures are pretty good for online meetings. If you can distill your message into a simple image, that really, really helps. People look at a lot of words on screen. For me, this slide, in fact, you're looking at right now, is very wordy for an online slide. The reason I've got it in is because this is going to be available afterwards as probably a blog post and definitely as a video. And so I put it in because this stuff's actually quite useful. But if I was presenting without that in mind, I'd probably have half as much content and twice as many pictures. Some people like to put in pre-recorded videos. This can be a little bit difficult because people, again, they switch into TV mode when they see a pre-prepared video because the person isn't reactive in front of you. And so a lot of people, you hear someone talking and I say, and now I'm going to show you a 5-minute video we prepared earlier. And it might be a very slick 5-minute video, but you feel as if the connection's gone because you're now listening to something which you feel is a little bit more deliberate, even if it's not. So have a think about that and whether it really helps with your connection or not. So Leon, it's over to you on this, and I'm sure you'll have some fun with this.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of stuff on there. So let's just try. Let me make one point first, because my experience that when you do a face-to-face, the 3 elements of persuasion, you can actually apply them quite easily. However, when you come to online, I think the ability to demonstrate your credentials and also demonstrate your emotions or kind of promote that is a lot harder. So my sense is, and again, this is my big idea here, I think structuring on the online is actually everything. If you can structure it right, then I think people will follow you and follow that persuasion. And the structuring is about structuring in such a way that you maintain the connection. So it's not so much about presenting. I'm trying to connect with you guys that you're listening, because I have something important to say, and I want to share that so that you have some fun and they will find some use to it. So that is a kind of connection. It's not about presenting. If you were putting something in between and stop that connection, it actually hinder the persuasion. So it's not so much about whether your slide is slick and so on. These are important, but however, you want to maintain that kind of a flow and connection. So a couple of tips, maybe you want to try. How would you, if you're in a situation that you don't really know, or perhaps you only work with the people occasionally on the presentation or on the online meeting, and you need to establish rapport very quickly, and it's online. That is hard. How do you do that? And one of the really important thing about rhetoric is they said people tend to trust people that they feel are similar to themselves. So let me say that again, right? If they think that you have something in common, so very simple, try to establish some common things. Maybe you find out one of the audience there like to jogging, food, whatever that. If you can build that identification, you have a better chance of connecting. Now, it's a kind of trick, but it's also demonstrating that you're taking the step to investigate how you connect with the audience. Now, sometimes you're lucky, sometimes you're not, because you don't really know much about the people. And then you have to find, that's part of the preparation. And I think there is another really important trick, and it's actually known for hundreds and hundreds of years. How many points should there be in the presentation? It's always 3 points. Whatever you do, so basically you have a bait, you then have a big idea introduction. I got 3 points, and then I conclude. There's a psychological effect that whenever people hear 3 points, they kind of relax. Oh, there's only 3 points. Just imagine you're sitting there. I got 17 points. You're gonna just about want to die. You just said too long. 2 points not convincing. So 5 points seem too many. So I think there are things about the 3-point structuring, and these are experience gained through many years. So the structure that we put together with Richard is like, there is a big idea. They wanted to talk to you about persuasion. And we kind of started with a bait, just draw you in. And then there's 3 points we made. We're going to talk about preparation, structuring, and delivery. So it's easy for you to remember that. And I think when we finish, we'll come back and hit you with a big idea again and call to action. That's really the structuring. And it's a bit like the mental style, but you can remember it. And you don't have to look at your slide because you actually remember the structure in your head, and you can play around, you can be flexible. I think this is actually the trick that the people who've been practicing rhetoric for many years kind of gain that kind of experience. I think with practice, you can get immediate improvement, perhaps 10%, 20%, 30%. You don't have to be a fantastic orator, but I believe putting some thoughts in terms of how to persuade and how to structure, I think you gain your head start. So I think that's quite a lot more to talk about it. And the go back to the same point, I think you need to know how to end. You need to start well and end well. So let's come back to another trick as well. You always end with a bit of emotional uplift. I think, well, why is that? The neuroscience actually means that by triggering an emotional response, people remember more what you just said to them. Now, don't ask me why. That's just the case. That's just the case. And because you provoke, you look at most of the effort just before they want to sell you something, they'll put a very emotive message, and you remember. And that's all. That's something. So therefore, how would you do that in your online communication presentation? That's part of the structuring.
I'm remembering something that Leon and I did a few years ago when we were doing a training session for a government IT department in persuasion. And we'd asked them to come in the morning and persuade us. So you have to persuade Richard and Leon on something. And both of us had publicly visible LinkedIn profiles with all this information about us, all the places we've worked before. And we were kind of hoping that some of these guys would come in and they'd say, well, I see that you used to work at the Jockey Club, so I'll talk to you about ABC. And so they came in, they did none of that. And what I had is I'd prepared on the whiteboard all the stuff they could have got from our LinkedIn, and I'd hidden the whiteboard behind a projector. So they all did their little pictures, and I lifted the thing and said, right, look, guys, these are the things you could have found out about us for free in about 5 minutes. And you're trying to persuade us through persuading about yourself. You've not taken the time to look at who the target is. You know, we're your target. You're trying to learn what's Richard into. What can I, he's done this. Maybe he'll know about this, or maybe he'll care about that. So this is in your structuring work as well. It's part preparation. It's part structuring. Who are the people, and why do they care, and what can you find out about them that you can write something that you think they'll care about. Okay, so now we'll quickly skip through the do and don'ts on structuring your presentation. So do think carefully about your audience. And if you can find out something about your audience, do. Will you have their attention throughout is a key decision because it impacts the way you're going to present. Choose a structure and style that best fits with the audience culture and context, and have a persuasion strategy. Culture, very important in Hong Kong. The difference between persuading to different cultural groups, huge differences in whether people respond to emotions or whether they respond to logic or whether they respond to authority. And you've really got to think about that, and especially when you mix audiences, and you've got to think about how your message plays out. Time it, yep, it's just good practice. If you can control how you want the session to run, when you want interaction, when you want to be presenting, don't mention stuff once and assume the audience was paying attention and rely on it later without repeating it. There's an old TV series trick where if you turn on the TV show halfway through, you're supposed to be able to understand the key plot details within about 3 or 4 minutes because the characters are repeating them enough. Same in a presentation. If you're not sure when your audience is coming in, just have a repeat going on, just to keep that same theme going. Don't put too much stuff into the slides. Like Leon says, 3 points. If you overload it, it doesn't work and you end up rushing through slides with too much information. Much better to go slower and have less stuff. And don't abandon storytelling just because it's harder, because it's a very powerful tool, and we've been telling stories throughout this presentation. We're just not delivering the main thing as a story. So let's go on to delivering your argument for remote work. So aim your delivery at your expected audience in argument type and in language style. So we've talked about argument type. Language style is a good one. We can talk in the next point. Slow down, speak clearly. No one is persuaded by things they don't understand. And then clarity is vital and more difficult online. If in doubt, use the simplest form of an argument and simple language. So this is really important because face-to-face, you do a lot of things that help people understand the context of a sentence. Things like subtlety don't work as well online. So you are better off going simple and using simpler words because the key is being heard and understood. And that's quite a tricky thing to do if you spent your life finding the most eloquent form of a sentence or of an argument. I used to be into speech writing. It was one of my little pet projects I used to be into, and it's a good lesson for this. It's about the simplest form of the idea. So you can't control how your audience sees you on screen. I can't control how you're seeing me right now. I don't know if I'm hidden in a window and you're listening to me. I don't know if I'm half the screen and you've got the slide on the other half. I don't know. And that means I don't know how big my face is. If you're looking at this on a phone, my face could be tiny. And if I do something with my face that's important, you're missing it. So put your attention into your voice. Make the emotions obvious. Make the words clear. Use the rhythm of a phone call conversation when guiding when to speak and when to listen. Now, with Leon, him and I have a pre-approved thing where if I'm going to ask him to speak, I'll say in a second, I'll ask Leon, and I'll give him 7 or 8 seconds to get ready to speak. So he's never caught having a sip of water halfway through. And it's that type of rhythm that you should introduce deliberately into your online meetings. So also be prepared to do more talking than usual, because quite often you'll get little to no questions. And be careful about that energy and keeping the energy going. Energy is a funny one. Energy is about connection to what you're saying and there being a nice speed to it. So you're learning at the right speed. If we're going too slowly for you, you disengage. If we're going too quickly for you, you've lost track of what we're trying to say. There's too much information. Energy isn't about trying to say things quickly and loudly. So try and avoid letting the energy drop. And then eye contact with the camera if you can. So there's a few tricks to this. In my case, what I have right now, I have the camera sitting on a yoga brick in front of my screen, and it's quite low down. And then I have the slide just above the screen and my face, or Leon's face, just above the camera. So when I'm looking at Leon's face, it looks close enough like I'm looking at the camera. If I hadn't done this, you'd be seeing this the whole time, and you'd be seeing my eyes all the way up here or all the way down here, reading the slide. And that's quite disengaging because people don't get the feeling you're looking at them. So look at that camera. It's unfamiliar look at a camera. It doesn't look back at you, but get used to having your eyes on the camera. Yeah, these are some of the tricks we used to do. The voice is the most important thing. It's the ability to, even if you're going for a logical argument, the way you modulate your tone of voice shows that you find this personally compelling. It shows you believe in the argument, and your argument might be logical, but you're putting emotive framework over the top of that logic. So whenever I persuade, even if I dress up my arguments as logic, I'm always persuading on an emotive level, even if it's just, I really believe in this, you should believe in it too, which is probably the lowest form of persuasion. It's still emotive words, trying to use the modulation of the words in a way that has your voice, demanding attention. Okay, over to Leon on this one. I'm sure, again, this is one of his favorite things, and he's just frustrated at only having a few minutes to speak on it.
No, that's quite right. So I'm thinking about the difference. I mean, some of the greatest orators, I mean, the Churchill, the Obama, and all that, when they have a platform, they choose language very carefully. Now, if you were to use Cantonese or Chinese to present, it's quite different, right? It's quite different because the structure is different, the sound is different. In English, you're probably wise to choose words that action words, simple words. A rule of thumb is choose the old Anglo-Saxon words. Don't use word which is French, Latin, or borrowed, because those are conceptual words. Because the story was French was used in the court of England for Britain for a long time, and therefore all the conceptual legal words are mostly in French and Latin, while Anglo-Saxon words are talking about day-to-day stuff, one syllable, two syllable, and it's easy to understand. You don't create conceptual stuff. When you talk about things like sophisticated, your mind had to twist around a couple of times thinking, well, what does that actually mean? You have to find the right words to make it easier for the audience to maintain their attention. Richard touched on speed, and also interesting, sometimes you might be prepared to pause. Now, I think you have to play very, very carefully in an online situation because a lot of people don't know what to do when you pause. Another thing interesting is we kind of assume presenting is one way. How would you deal with a situation which is interactive? So if I'm talking to Richard and I kind of having that conversation and I'm persuading, I got a set piece, I'm persuading, I'm trying to interact and connect with Richard. The ability to ask questions and play back is really key to persuade. So for examples, Richard might say something to me, he make a long, perhaps maybe a few seconds on a particular point. Now, one way to do that would play it back to him and say, Richard, let me see if I have understood what you just said to me. You play back, use the words that Richard used. You then create that rapport and create that empathy and create that connection. And obviously the right point, then you move in and talk about your point of view. I think that is actually important to actually have that interaction and you maintain that credibility. It's part of being respectful to your audience, but also part of ability to connect and partly trying to be persuasive as well.
Yeah, and there's that thing where the paraphrasing confirms to the person that you're talking to that you've heard them. Because I think that people are quite used to speaking without the full expectation that the audience is really listening. And paraphrasing is always, oh, good, you actually did get what I was saying. It's a good starting point. So Leon and I used that. Every conversation we've ever had as consultants involves some level of paraphrasing.
And just to interrupt, Richard, I think there's also pick up. I mean, there's another long subject and another time that from the therapeutic world that you pick the words that the other person used. So for example, if you're talking about speed, you might use the word speed and you might use the word pace. When I play it back to you, then I will use the same word you use and automatically think, this guy's listening to me. So paraphrasing, but also picking up key concept, key words the other person used. It's part of being respectful But again, that person will kind of continue to explain that concept and you become very clear. Then you establish that rapport and maintain that rapport over the conversation. It's not necessarily a presentation or presenting is really about, and delivering is a kind of metaphor. You're really building that connection that you're trying to connect and therefore exchange ideas and come to some agreement. That's really what persuading is about.
Okay, so let's just have a quick look at some of the examples of this. So stuff to do: tailor your delivery style to the audience. The balance between information evidence versus emotional persuasion. And I think we'll add to that one also advice versus authority. I mean, Leon and I have had a lot of circumstances where we've been in rooms. Sometimes it's CIOs and sometimes it's quite junior players, and you have to really change the way you deliver the same bit of information. Whether you're going in authoritatively, whether you're going in because I'm an expert or because I have rank. Very strong in Hong Kong. It's particularly important here that you understand what permissions you have available to you given the description, the title you have in a certain context. So that changes the way you play that. So again, slow down. Slow down is something that always feels a little bit unnatural. If you slow down and you start to be quite conscious and you think this doesn't sound right, usually 9 times out of 10, actually it sounds great. It's just that it's not quite going at the pace you're used to. But online, everything's a little bit harder. Even with a good microphone and good speakers and a good internet connection, little things get lost, and slowing down just helps. Get the feel for the amount of engagement from the audience and be prepared to continue with little to no feedback. It doesn't mean something is wrong. And it would mean something is wrong in a lot of circumstances. You've got to train yourself not to mind that you're not getting that level of feedback that you're used to. So as I mentioned earlier, talk to your webcam like it's a human being. Keep up the eye contact with that webcam and be personable with the webcam in front of you. Again, quite an alien thing to do, just something that comes with practice. So things not to do. For people who are used to moving a lot in persuasion, so people who walk, if you're used to walking around the room when you're presenting, pointing and hand gestures, you've got to take that energy and make sure it's in your voice, because you rely on that energy, and some people like to put it into physical nature and don't really have it in the voice. You need to make sure it's in the voice, because they might not be able to see you. You can't, like I said earlier, you can't control it, and because you can't control it, you should compensate as if it's not going to work out in your favor. So Leon said, don't use complicated language. Or subtle inferences. That's a great example of a phrase not to use in a conversation. Subtle inferences. It's the sort of thing that in a face-to-face conversation or networking you use all the time, but it's harder online. It's harder to quite be sure that what someone meant. So don't let people guess. Make sure you're understood, and don't let the screen, the camera, and the silence make you feel unconnected. People might be connecting brilliantly with you. They might be hanging off every word, and you don't know that. So talk as if they are. Talk as if the people really are interested, really are engaged, because it's a more compelling way of talking, and it's likely to work out better for you. So Leon, do you have any more final do's and don'ts or final tips on this before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I think in terms of language, back to the point about being online, because we don't have hand gestures or we don't have body language, you might have to describe things a lot better using the language and maintain the energy. So you might have to say something like, let me see how I can paint a picture and how does it sound, and really bring in those sensory elements and describe it, because there's no other way you can do it. And I think these are just slightly very different when you're online. And use pictorial, use sound, switch your metaphor, and try to cater for different audience. But your point is, you have to remember why you're there in the first place. These are tools that help you to maintain connection and maintain engagement. But you have something you want to persuade. And therefore, just maintain that and be clear that you get to where you need to be. Now, there's no guarantee you're going to get there, but if you don't know why you're there and you don't have a method and a strategy, you're probably not going to get there. So over back to you, Richard.
Okay, thank you, Leon. So that's it. So I hope you like this. We love persuasion. It's actually a very difficult topic to do a 1 hour webinar on because, because I mean, I remember I think the very last time that we trained in this, it was 3 days of training just to train an IT department in being more persuasive when talking to uh, product owners. And that was 3 days because there's so much material and there's so much good stuff. So I hope that we distilled some essence of it that was useful to you, especially from the dimension of if you're naturally persuasive in face-to-face and you want to know what's changed and what you can adapt to, well, hopefully this is going to help you. And please do have a look at the other webinars we've got. We'll have more coming in the future. We have the last one already online. This one will be online. I'll put the deck up as well. Quite happy to share that information. So Leon, anything else to add before we open it up for any questions?
I think just again, thank you for your time. I think it's a lot of fun for us to do this.
Yes, it is.
And we'd like to continue the series, and will be a variety of speakers, not just Richard and myself, to talk about topics that are highly relevant to kind of post-COVID world. How can we be more effective professionals? So hope that you continue to come and join us. And thank you for your time. I'd like to open up for questions now. We'll probably have a few minutes. How do you encourage people to ask questions? Are there any techniques? Interesting question from Gail. So exactly what we're trying to do here. I think the one perhaps where we do that would be you break down maybe you pause at different point, and then you one way to do that is you know your audience, you might name person, because sometimes it's quite hard. You might have to say that, well, KL, would you have a question? Richard, perhaps any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I would plan it like that. If I have people in the audience who I know are going to be there, actually, it's useful to, because what you might have 2 or 3 people who you know, and then exactly, KL's just said it. You get a plant or two, and you normalize it. It's about what's normal. So if you finish it and immediately 2 people can't wait to ask questions, then other people just get the natural social clue that asking questions is the right thing to do here. Yeah, questions is a good one. I go to a lot of webinars myself, and often I don't have questions because myself, I take on the information and I take a few days to digest it. And you ask me 3 days later, well, you've had to think about it. What do you think now? I've got plenty of questions. But on the spur of the moment, unless I've got, hey, here's my trouble issue, can you help me with my trouble issue? I wouldn't normally have it, but I certainly would plant people in the audience. Thank you, KL, you're a great plant, well done.
I think another way we're doing online is you might prompt question earlier, and therefore you have a set of questions that you might want to use the chat facilities, which is a unique feature of an online situation that you don't have when you're doing perhaps face-to-face. So that would be another way to do it. You might have some prepare questions up front.
Yeah, or you ask your audience a question. So you get a third of the way through, then you say, hey guys, we're going to ask you this. I'd really like it if you can answer it in the chat window, then we'll come to the answers by the end, or if you can answer it at the end. And so you give people time to think, because if people haven't been sitting there formulating a question, some personality types will be happy just to go whatever's in their head quite happily. Other people will be quite reticent, and they'll only want to ask a question if they really think it's a good question. And maybe they think, well, maybe it was already answered and I missed it. So if you introduce a topic, so earlier on we could have said, hey guys, why don't you tell us what you find to be the most effective thing when you do this type of persuasion or whatever it is, and then you give people 15 minutes to think about it, and then Kim says, could you use a quiz? We use quizzes. Quizzes are great things to put into the middle of training sessions. So especially if you do like an online quiz, multiple choice online thing, and it pops up, and these people who have been having to sit through 6 hours of training, they're like, oh good, we get to get to some questions, and then you make them sort of a bit lighthearted, 3 funny answers, and but maybe it's a good teaching point, and people who wouldn't put their hand up to ask questions will quite happily engage with an online quiz.
So there's a comment here from John, and finds out as persuasion. Would you include more, as you are the first I've been to bring this into the virtual? Well, I think I have restricted myself on a lot around rhetoric. I think what Robert Cadini actually looked at, I think he came from a slightly different angle, but you spotted it. There's something here. I mean, in fact, I use a lot of that with my husky. So the law of scarcity. So actually, he might not want to eat anything, but if I apply that, even an animal who can't speak will succumb. So and those are great stuff. But I think in my mind, presentation online is more direct. It's nothing covert, nothing below the line. So I probably use the Canadian stuff without knowing it. So thanks for that point, John. Thank you again for this, and hopefully watch out for, keep an eye on another one that coming probably in 4 to 6 weeks time. For me, it's goodbye, and from Richard.
Yep, I've really enjoyed this. It's actually always fun putting these together, and I love it when someone calls up one of our sources. It's great, really. I like that. Thank you very much. Have a great week. We'll have this available online, and look out for the next one. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Bye, guys. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.